Hey everyone, welcome to the Eat to Win show where sports nutrition meets peak performance. Get ready for expert insights, real stories, and tips to help you win with every meal. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Winner's Circle and the Eat to Win podcast show. I am Margaret Downs, a registered dietitian, board certified in sports nutrition, and we are here to talk about all things sports nutrition and how we help athletes win. Today, we are excited to welcome Jena Brown, who is also a registered dietitian, board certified in sport, and she is the owner of her private practice, Victorim Performance Nutrition. Jena takes an integrative approach to helping endurance athletes optimize their fueling, hydration, and overall performance. Today, we'll be discussing personalized sports nutrition, how to leverage biomarker testing, wearable devices, and supplementation while avoiding data overload. So let's dive in. Jena, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to learn from you and appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So we will just start out today just learning a little bit more about you and how you came into this area of practice and kind of what stimulated your passion for it.
Yeah. So I began running over 20 years ago. If that kind of ages me a little bit. But I was in college when I started running, and I began for just health and physical activity. And like many endurance athletes, sometimes this can become a little bit of an over obsession. So at that time, it actually led me into an unhealthy place. Whereas, the whole purpose of beginning obviously was for my health. But yeah, it led me into, an obsession with my mileage and, what my food intake was and physical appearance. And so, that definitely impacted me later as I, began my professional career. At that time, I was not aware of, the correlation between nutrition and signs and physical signs and symptoms. So anyway, all of those things impacted me as a professional. And then later, I just wanted to share that with other endurance athletes, how to fuel your body and to avoid those extremes that we see commonly.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely sounds you had a personal experience with the things that surround a lot of athletes and their
Yeah.
performance driven mindset, right? Which is just
Yes,
trying to constantly be better, improve, feeling like they have to do it all perfectly at the same time. And that is a lot of pressure. So
it is.
yes, and having, I think, that personal history also lends into really being able to help other people. So I'm sure that's become an asset for you.
Definitely. And, talking about biomarker testing today, it's just another layer that adds to that pressure sometimes, but it can be a tool that can be used for you. And then at other times we have to look at, what kind of boundaries that we have to put into place when it comes to testing.
Yeah, great. Well, we look forward to learning more about that from you. So, what does an integrative approach to nutrition look like, and how do you apply that specifically to endurance athletes?
Yeah. So to me, an integrative approach is really just zooming out and getting a really big picture of what I usually call like the athlete's ecosystem, right? So we're dietitians and we talk about nutrition and what we're eating and what we're drinking. And sometimes, in other settings, I'm in private practice, but in other settings, dietitians don't have the opportunity to have those conversations with athletes about what does your day-to-day training look like, training load? What does your season to season training load look like? What kind of life stress do you have, whether that's coming from work or training, family demands, your social life, maybe even your personal expectations, like we were saying, all the pressure that sometimes athletes put on themselves. And also I kind of dive into, past traumatic experiences, whether, this could be anything from physical abuse or, some sort of experience as a child, maybe your parents divorced. How does that look like in terms of behavior when it comes to training and nutrition? But also, from other angles, we're looking at hormone status, and how is that impacted by training and how is that impacted by what we eat and your individual physiology and your genetics, which is where also biomarker comes into play. So there's just, a zooming out big picture approach to all the different pieces of the puzzle that impact your training, your performance, your health, your nutrition behaviors, all of those things.
Yeah, that's a big bucket of stuff,
Yes.
just all the things that impact a person and their capabilities to perform well. And so, what do you feel like are some of the biggest challenges you encounter working with this population and what they actually need from a nutritional standpoint?
So some common challenges that I see, like, so a bit on a basic level, hydration is a big challenge. But along with that, kind of leading into the next big one, I guess you can say, is extremes, the mindset of extremes, right? So this is in athletes and non-athletes, but if some is good, more must be better, or less is more. And so that could be related to supplementation. If some supplement is good, more must be better. Less is more, meaning, oh, if we need to dial back on something, over restricting, like there's different ways that those extremes can look. We can see extremes in hydration, dehydration to overhydration. And I think that overhydration, while I see dehydration often, right? Overhydration is a conversation. I think that messaging tells us, drink more water, which is often true. But when it comes to endurance, depending on the specific athlete, you can definitely overhydrate, and that can lead to complications too. And then I think the last one, maybe, I mean, there's a lot, but would be, the things that you don't directly feel. I talked about this on another podcast episode recently, and the example was using vitamin D. You don't always necessarily feel a nutrition deficiency, or if you do physically feel symptoms, they can correlate with other things. So, I think the power of the silence, maybe is the way to word it, is overlooked. And sometimes if you don't know otherwise, you think all is good. So if you think, oh, I feel good, but and it's actually not great, but that's how you've always felt, and you think you feel good, you don't know what great feels like. So,
Right. Yeah,
I
good
don't know.
point. Yeah, that definitely I think that really kind of moves a little bit of picks the rock up out of the way and says, hey, talk about this, like bring some of these things up to the surface and investigate, what maybe some of those deeper layers of challenge might be for you personally. So I know you do some data and technology. You have this integrated into your practice as well, and that you're using some biomarker testing and wearable devices. And so tell us a little bit more about this, because this is something that's become very popular in sports nutrition. And how do you decide when and how to use these tools?
Yeah, it's like you said, it's becoming very popular. And I think there's overuse and misuse and underuse of all of these things, right? I guess when it comes to biomarker testing, what I love about what's coming out is, when we look at clinical values, when you go to the doctor, for example, they're looking at reference ranges to identify disease or conditions, or where there's already a problem. Whereas when we're talking about an active individual, by the time we get to that point, it's probably a really big problem. We are past the point where intervention should have taken place. So, just adjusting those reference ranges, which I don't do personally. I offer blood testing through a particular company, and of course, it's an evolving space, informing people of that as well. But also, I offer omega-3 index testing, which is another area of emerging research. And that, of course, there's performance correlations. We need omega-3s for recovery. When I'm working with triathletes who are on the bike, we're at a high risk for head injury. So, kind of coming in from that angle. And so that's a big one for overall health and for performance. And then wearable devices. We have these sweat testing or sweat sodium testing, electrolyte testing devices that people are wearing. Of course, we have our Garmins and our watches and those kind of electronic devices, but also like CGMs that are coming out for athletes. That's an emerging area, which I'm super fascinated in.
And so what does CGM stand for? Just so our
Oh, yeah.
listeners can
Right, right.
identify with that.
Yes, yes. So a continuous glucose monitor, which normally, we hear for diabetics. And I know for years I've always been like, why are only I mean, not that everybody should be walking around with one, but I'm thinking, why is the emphasis only on diabetics? all of us need to have blood sugar control or should have blood sugar control. And, I think it's helpful too if people have misconceptions about fueling with products, right? Like when we're taking in sugar as fuel during an activity, a lot of people associate sugar to be, quote, bad, but how your body is using sugar during physical activity is different than when we're sitting sedentary. So I think that can help athletes, encourage them to feel better if they can see objectively, hey, this isn't harming my body in the way that, it's kind of manifested in media. Yeah, I think that's an example of how you can leverage it, is helping people overcome some of those messaging or ideas that, may not apply to somebody who's physically active.
Yeah, and it really applies, that glycemic index, which was the old school way of athletes using this, which again was developed for people with diabetes and abnormal,
Yeah.
you know, diagnostics with blood sugar control. And, we used to give it to athletes and say this is, but it gives real life application to that
Yes,
technique in terms of how your body is not only responding to glucose, but how it's being utilized. And so,
absolutely.
yeah, I'm with you. I think that's super awesome and also very enlightening.
Yes. Yeah, there's so much I could say about that.
Yes, and we could do a whole nother podcast on that. So that'd be great. Well, listen, stay with us for a moment, and we are going to take a break for a quick sponsor break, and we will be back. Liquid Fuel is a new sports and hydration product formulated by a sports dietitian to give athletes the edge to train and compete longer. It contains low glycemic carbohydrate platinose designed to keep blood sugar levels more stable, to provide energy for 3 to 4 hours without the blood sugar crash seen in other leading sports drinks. Its unique 4-part electrolyte formula includes 50% of your daily magnesium need to optimize muscle function. Liquid Fuel is naturally sweetened, along with no artificial ingredients or colors. Currently being used by high school, collegiate, and professional teams, Liquid Fuel allows you to live life with confidence, knowing you're properly fueling your body. Visit drinkliquidfuel.com and use the code MSD10 to get 10% off your order. So welcome back to the Eat to Win podcast, where we're talking with Jena Brown about personalized nutrition and performance fueling for endurance athletes. So let's just jump back in. And Jena, just a little while ago, you mentioned hydration and how crucial this is for endurance athletes. And so how do you personalize hydration protocols for optimal performance?
Yeah. So the first step is sweat rate, sweat volume. Sometimes you hear them used interchangeably. And really, sweat rate, that is simply understanding what your fluid loss is per hour. So that's the biggest thing. Are we losing, usually when I'm doing presentations, I'll hold a half-liter water bottle and I'll hold a 3-liter water bottle, which is actually kind of difficult to find. But that way people can see, am I losing less than a liter or half a liter of fluid per hour, or am I losing over 3 liters of fluid per hour? So that sweat rate tells you how much fluid am I losing. When we sweat, we lose fluid and electrolytes. And when it comes to personalizing your hydration strategy, we're not replacing 100% of our losses. Typically, where I will start athletes is 60 to 70% of their loss. So somebody who's losing more, say 2, 3 liters per hour, would actually replace less. And that's just because it's not practical, right, to ask an athlete to drink that much fluid. And it depends. In my case, for endurance athletes, it's a little bit, we can do that more easily versus if you're talking about a football player. I always kind of make a joke about what are they going to do, ask to time out because their sports dietitian says they need, 32 ounces of fluid per hour. Like, it doesn't work that way. So, the different considerations. But so sweat rate, that's the first step. The second step is if I have the opportunity, I'm going to offer sweat sodium testing. And in my practice, I use precision hydration sweat sodium testing. But then if I don't have an opportunity to work with an athlete in person, and maybe, they're virtual in another state or just another area of Texas, which is where I live. Maybe we are using electrolyte patches, to gauge how many sodium they're losing per hour. Or we can use symptoms that they may experience, such as, a history of muscle cramping or, salt crystals on their their skin or on their clothing. So kind of gauging what level of electrolyte loss they have. Sweat rate, sweat sodium, electrolyte loss per liter. Depending on what kind of testing you're using, the precision hydration will tell you your electrolyte loss per liter of fluid, which is why we need to know our sweat rate, versus some of the patches, they vary on how they, measure your electrolyte loss. Yeah.
That's really, really cool.
It's fun.
How do athletes, respond to this? I mean, when they get this information and they see this data.
So endurance athletes tend to be data driven and pretty diligent for the most part, which, can also lead into other things. So you kind of have to navigate that as the sports dietitian, but they do tend to respond very well. If anything, just the awareness of, whoa, I didn't realize, how much fluid I needed to replace, or how much better I feel when I'm replacing the proper electrolytes per hour. And again, in endurance is different because we can control a lot more, whether we're wearing a belt or a vest, or maybe if we're using aid stations at a race, for example. But I tend to prefer my athletes to wear or carry their fluid when it makes sense. So we have to kind of work through that. But it's received well, and the athletes definitely feel much better.
Yeah, I bet that's some great outcomes for you, being the dietitian, to be able to see those improvements and get that feedback that it's very beneficial. And so how do you help prevent them from becoming overly reliant on this data? Because you mentioned that. We want to know,
Yeah.
like, we don't want to get too hung up on it, right? So how do you prevent them from losing sight of those foundational nutritional principles?
Because of my personal journey and experience, honestly, I feel like I have a good intuition to kind of pick up on, sometimes information that they may volunteer, right? Somebody may volunteer that they have a history of something, or they may not, but I can pick up on certain things that they say or don't say when I'm working with them. So, by just learning and speaking to the athlete, I can also kind of gauge sometimes when they're filling out their intake forms, do we have a history of an eating disorder or restriction of some kind? If I know that, then the type of biomarker testing or wearable devices may change, or how we use it, right? And so I think that comes a little bit with my personal experience and my professional experience just as a dietitian. And then, also have to consider budget. It doesn't make sense. It's not practical for everybody. These things are not cheap or free. And so we have to consider, can we afford it? Accessibility in terms of, are we in person or not? But from overuse, it's really going to be, gauging just things that they say and their symptoms too. Would we benefit from more data, or or if we acquire data, if we have those data points, how or will we even use them? So I think a lot of it just comes from those individual conversations,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, that makes complete sense. And it also sounds very useful and personalized. So
Yeah,
you mentioned that personalized approach, and that's how you work with people. And I think that's worthy of mention, that there's not one size fits all, right? And it sounds like you're really investing a lot of that personalized approach in your practice. That's necessary, right? Because we know not everybody gets those same nutrition prescriptions. And sometimes that's what data, like the old school apps, it's like, here's how much you need, your carbs, your proteins, your
yes,
fats, and people got so bogged down with numbers that they lost sight of, you need your nutrients, you need
right.
your vitamins and your minerals and all the things, and not so regulated.
Yeah, and that's also why I love the integrative approach too, is, we have conventional sports nutrition messaging and recommendations, which serves a really good place for a lot of athletes. But then we have other athletes who that doesn't work for them, or they want something different. They're seeking something different. And so when you're working in that personalized space, you're able to, kind of work outside the boundaries is kind of the way I view it. We can put unconventional practices in place or try them. And whether that is from your experience as an athlete, maybe we've suffered something with conventional practices and saying, this is not a good option for me. Or maybe we're leveraging some of that, the biomarker testing or the data from wearable devices. Consider unconventional approaches. So that is an opportunity where that can definitely help you kind of consider different options outside the box, so to speak. But again, it's going to depend on the individual, ultimately, the individual where they're at in their process too.
Well, and I always think about those informed like standards that we were trained in, which are the textbook, right, protocols that we were taught as sports dietitians, and that's definitely our starting point.
Yes.
But then when you actually get into practice, you're just working with all different kinds of people. And so it does take a creative approach and critical thinking to really bring out the best approach for everybody.
Absolutely.
So you make a good point in saying that. So lastly, Jenna, we just want to kind of touch a little bit on supplement recommendations. I mean, this is obviously something people are doing in every aspect of sport. Younger athletes being also really susceptible to just media marketing and information. So I wanted to ask you, how do you approach supplement recommendations while ensuring safety and effectiveness for the athletes that you work with?
Right. So, again, because I am in a private practice setting, then I get to have those individual conversations. So the recommendations that I'm making in a one-on-one scenario, that's going to be different than if I'm working with a group or a team, right? You're going to make more broad, generalized recommendations or avoid them. Regardless of the scenario, third-party testing, right? We want to make sure they're third party tested, which means in my mind, I use NSF certified for sport, informed sport, USP verified, or a professional grade dispensary. And so I use a professional grade dispensary to provide direct supplement recommendations versus if I said, hey, you need a vitamin D supplement that's 5,000 IUs or whatever it may be. And then they go to the store and walk out with more is better. We want the 10,000 IU, or we want the less expensive brand that's not third party tested. And so that's why I use the dispensary, is to make sure that we have these products that are being stored in safe conditions. They're from not in the heat and the light and all of those things. So yes, third-party testing, individualized approach. And just because they're third-party tested doesn't mean they're clean either, right? I'm sure you've seen this. What I'll tell athletes is the testing gives us more confidence that the label is accurate and that it doesn't contain things that are not listed, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other ingredients or additives that probably aren't health promoting in there. So I also, in the way I practice, is I look for those ingredients that I prefer my athletes to avoid just to support their overall health.
Yeah. And for athletes who are, having to follow like collegiate and professional athletes, obviously need to be using those NSF certified
Yes.
products. Key point there, and really appreciate that. We really want to find out how to connect with you. I mean, you just have a great approach. We love all of the unique things that you're doing with your biomarker testing, your individualized approach, and obviously informed supplementation. And so all of those things are critical elements for all athletes to know about. So how can we get in touch with you, Jena?
Yeah, so my website is victorum.com. I know you mentioned previously, my business is Victorum Performance Nutrition. So you can find me on my website, victorum.com, or on social media, Instagram and Facebook. The handle is at Victorum Nutrition. So yeah, I'd love to connect.
Super. Well, if you don't mind, I want to do a real quick rapid fire round. We don't have a
Ooh,
lot of time, but I
yeah,
love this because it just gives some really quick answers to maybe somebody's burning questions.
I
So,
love it.
if you had to choose between morning or evening training, what is your preference?
Morning, absolutely, which I think
Awesome.
might be surprising.
Because you have all that energy in the morning. That's
I
why.
do.
Especially women.
Yeah,
Women with kids, morning.
right.
Favorite go-to pre-race meal?
So this usually changes season to season. Past season, it was definitely my Dave's Killer Bread. I'm at my Dave's Killer Bread bagel,
That's
cinnamon
nice.
raisin. Yes. With no, I use 2% milk and lots of bananas. That was
Ooh,
my pre-race. It wasn't,
love it.
yeah,
Simple, very
very simple.
simple.
It has to
Yes,
be portable because,
straightforward.
I'm traveling for the race, so it's something I can
Yeah.
pack in my suitcase.
Simple and balanced, and you can
Yeah,
just carry it anywhere you go. I love
yeah.
it. Practicing what you preach. So, what is the biggest sports nutrition myth you would love to bust up? Is
I
there
guess,
one?
there's too many. I think it depends on the day, what we're battling. Carbs are always a battle. The overuse or underuse, that would be a myth, the over and underuse of carbs. What kind of context does that apply? But then, fat, I think there's a place we could talk about that. And then, I don't know, there's a lot. Carbs is a big one.
Well, that is it for the Eat to Win podcast today. We thank you all for joining us. If you will, please like, subscribe, and rate our podcast today. We would greatly appreciate that. And we will see you again. Until then, just keep winning.
Thanks for joining us on the Eat to Win show. Remember, every meal is a step toward victory. Until next time, stay strong and keep winning.